So as we continue to talk about faithfulness, I hope that we're all engaging this topic honestly and even critically in our own lives. If we're doing that, if we are looking at ourselves and saying, what do I need to do to be faithful? Maybe even looking at ourselves and being, maybe I need to do that better, or maybe do that differently, then I think we would inevitably keep coming back to questioning whether this is something I'm even capable of. Really. As we talk about faithfulness, we should come back to this if we're engaging it critically, right? Is this something, am I capable of being faithful in that way? Faithfulness is not just difficult, but the degree to which we're called to practice it, let's admit it, is downright impossible. I am not capable of this kind of faithfulness, and neither is anyone else that I have ever met. If we're being honest, then we shall all, at some point or another, be coming to this conclusion. One of the marks of maturity in Christians, in a Christian, is beyond just having the integrity to be honest with ourselves and be critical of ourselves to that degree, is the understanding that we're called to a perfection that we know full well that we will never get to while we remain on this earth. We are called to become something that's, well, frankly, we're never going to be able to become until we are with Christ again. Right? But yet we are still called to strive towards that, right? We are being made into something perfect, something Christ-like, but we are not there yet. A mature Christian will always strive towards becoming something more. But a mature Christian will also do that with the understanding that they are not there. They're not going to get there until Christ comes back, and therefore they're going to be able to have peace throughout the process. They're not going to beat themselves up and say, I'm a terrible person because I'm not there. Right? Remember Paul? I've learned to become content in all circumstances. Paul's not just talking about in rich and poor. What he's talking about is he talks about his failings and his successes as well. Peace is the ability to come to a peace is part of being a mature Christian. It comes from an understanding. Mature Christian does not become distressed because they need God's grace, but rather they praise God because they need God's grace. They praise God for His grace rather than becoming stressed because of it. Now, while some of us may be more mature than others, none of us can really be described, not a single one of us can really be described as mature, as we're supposed to be. Right? I hope that it's always a fear for me as we're talking about topics like this. We're talking about, well, some of us are more mature than others. I hope that the topic of maturity does not evoke in you some sense of superiority, in the sense of you view yourself as more mature than someone else. The very thought of superiority, of thinking of myself as more mature than someone else, is evidence of immaturity. Right? A mature Christian has no need for measurements. We don't need to stand against someone else to find our worth, find our value, because we find our worth in God alone. When we stop measuring ourselves against others, we don't simply stop hurting other people and inflating our egos, but we actually find ourselves in a place of peace. Because one thing we will always find when we measure ourselves against others is we will always find someone who we don't measure up to. We're never on top. And if we find our sense of self-worth based on how we measure up against others, then we're inevitably going to find ourselves being crushed by the measuring process, aren't we? Only a certifiable egomaniac would never have an experience of feeling like they don't measure up to someone at some point in time or another. I think there's a reason why, this is the reason why God never wants us to measure ourselves or our self-worth against one another. That being said, I believe that if we are to gain a better understanding of faithfulness, we cannot only experience greater peace, but we can move towards greater maturity if we have a better understanding of what faithfulness is. Then we, like Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, can say that we have learned in every situation to be content. One thing that can make our journey towards faithfulness very difficult, as if it's not difficult enough, right, is that oftentimes we think that in order for us to be faithful, we need to go out and we need to save the world. We need to do something big. We need to do something grand. Big things are the marks of faithfulness, after all, aren't they? And frankly, we haven't done much in that regard, right? We like the number 149 yesterday because that's a big number. So it sounds like we did something great and big. And we did. Don't get me wrong. We did something great and big. But even if we'd had 20 people show up, guess what? We still would have done something great and big. When God asks us to be faithful, is He asking for us to do something grand? Like, say, for example, Paul's missionary journeys? Would anything less mean that we're not being faithful? Now, there can be many different answers to that same question, because God's plan and desire for each of us is different, isn't it? Right? There are grand things in our minds that happen, aren't there? Right? And people do great big things for God. That does not mean that that's what God has planned for everyone. And that does not mean that the person who has done something that we consider to be great and grand is any more faithful than the person God has called to do something maybe less flashy. Right? His plan for us is only grand or small according to our definition. According to God, even if He's having us do something small, it is something grand. Right? It is by our defining and our choosing to make our actions of some kind of value to us, the defining of our self-worth, that make them grand or small. Right? God doesn't grade them like that. God grades, did you do what I asked you to do? Right? Imagine what went on with David, right? David asked, God, I want to build you a temple. I want to build you a house. And God goes, no. I'm going to build you a house, though. Do you think God was pleased with David even though He didn't build him a house? It was the desire in the heart that God was after, not the grand display of the desire in the heart. Every single one of God's plans, so the one He has for each of us, are good plans. One plan is no more good than the other. There's not good and gooder. There is just good. The main point that I want to get at today is that whether God is calling us to things that we describe, and I want to stress whether God is calling us to things that we describe as grand or small, He's never calling us to do something new. Rather, what He's calling us to is something quite old. I say that with caution. Caution because I don't want you to hear that God never calls us to do things differently, because He does. But rather, that every situation is unique, isn't it? Right? Every situation we encounter is unique. In fact, the same situation encountered in 2 separate days could require an entirely different response each time, couldn't they? What I mean by saying that God doesn't require anything new of us is that God never calls us to something that He hasn't already done before. What God calls us to, what is required of us, the Spirit in the heart, is not something new. Think about it. Okay. God says, forgive. Is He calling you to do something new? No, God's already forgiven. God was the first to forgive. Heck, God forgave us before we were even created. Okay. Love. Is He calling us to something new? God is love. Be holy. Oh, wait. That reminds me of something back next. Be holy because the Lord your God is holy. He's not calling us to anything new. But rather, He's calling us to something that is quite old. God does not want us, when we talk about being faithful, God doesn't want us to go out and recreate the wheel. Rather, He wants us to do something that's already been done. Right? God is faithful. God calls us to be faithful, just like God was faithful. He's calling us to live in a manner for which there is already a plan, already a sense of order. Don't try to find a new answer. Rather, find a way to apply the old answer to a new problem. Right? Think about it for a moment. This discussion came up in our Wednesday class sometime back when we were talking about the fruits of the Spirit. Does anyone remember our fruits of the Spirit offhand? Come on.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control.
Perfect. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are the fruits of the Spirit. Those are the things we are supposed to be doing, right? Now, in that list, how many of those things are new things? Not a single one. How many of those things if we look back in our Bible, do we have an example of God Himself doing? Every single one. Let me give you another specific example. Where this is more specific to faithfulness. Turn with me over to Isaiah 65. Isaiah chapter 65. I'm going to start in verse 1. Isaiah chapter 65. This is an example of God's faithfulness to His people. Isaiah chapter 65. I was ready to be sought by those who did not ask for me. I was ready to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that was not called by my name. I spread out my hands all day to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices. A people who provoke me to my face continually. What is going on here? What is happening? Well, God here is describing His history with Israel. He's constantly chasing after them. Or, insert our word today, right? He is constantly being faithful to them. Faithful to them who are unfaithful. They're constantly rejecting Him. They don't want anything to do with God. They commit atrocities against the poor, atrocities against women, atrocities against each other. They are greedy gluttons that scheme against one another. There is deception and corruption. There is pain and suffering that is entirely avoidable. Not brought on because God is punishing them, but because when you take advantage of someone, what is going to happen? You're going to be taken advantage of. So instead of abandoning what even we would describe as a worthless people, God seems to take on the role of a beggar. I was ready to be found, but no one was looking. They don't want to come to me, and so I'm standing on the street corner saying, here I am, here I am. It sounds like that beggar with this cardboard sign on the side of the road, doesn't it? God is essentially begging His people to come back to Him. And they're ignoring Him. But it isn't just anyone who is ignoring them. It's a nation who claims to be His children. A nation that is causing the whole world to say, maybe He isn't such a great God after all. And God's pursuing these people. To these kinds of people, God is spreading out His hands all day long. How often do you find the ones who are begging are the ones who have not? But in this case, it's not the ones who are lacking who are begging, but rather it's the one who has to give who's begging. It's as if we're standing on a street corner, not with a sign asking for money, but a sign asking to give to those who pass by. In fact, it gets so bad that if we look a little further down to verse 5, we see Israel saying to God, yourself. Do not come near me, for I am too holy for you. Israel just said that to God. And yet, God is standing there with his hands open wide to these people. How many times have you heard that text preached in church? A people who claim to be of God, essentially speaking to God and saying, I am too holy for you. You have to read that twice, maybe even 3 times, just to be sure that you read that right. The people of Israel actually told God to go away because they were too holy. I mean, doesn't just reading that aloud make you feel like you have to duck under a chair or something because there's going to be some lightning bolt streaming from heaven? I mean, wow, that's really big. I don't know if I've heard anything in Scripture said more offensive than that. Right? How could you offend God any more than saying that right there? Whew. Don't words like that demand a response? But this is where God's example of faithfulness comes in. Because it does demand a response. But the response we get isn't the response we expect. How does God respond to these people? Does he blot them out for eternity? Forsake them to their devices? Wipe them from the face of the earth? Well, in fact, he does quite the opposite, doesn't he? To the ones who said they were too holy for God, God sends his Son to die on a cross that they might find life. To the ones who said, God, go away, we're too holy for you, God sends his Son to die on a cross so that they might be saved. To these, God offers adoption as sons and daughters. A little further down in Isaiah 65 comes one of my favorite texts about the new heavens and the new earth. This is after they've just said these terrible things. Specifically in response to these rebellious people, God replies in verse 19, I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. They just said, I am too holy for you, stay away from me. And God just says, I'll rejoice and be glad in you, and no more will there be weeping and crying in your presence. That's what it means for God to be faithful. So when you see this kind of faithfulness on display, how does it change your understanding of faithfulness and what we're called to do? Imagine the faithfulness we're called to in light of that has already been practiced. Not only does God call us to something new, but this is something we have to understand. God calls us to something old, not something new, right? Something he's already done, given us an example, showed us how to do. But he never calls us to something as grand as he did it, does he? God's calling us to do like he did, but to never have to do as much as he did, right? We imagine Paul talking about Jesus, right? We will never have to suffer to the extent that he suffered, but we are called to suffer for Christ. God always calls us to something with which he has given us an example and a way and a plan to show us how to do it, and he never calls us to something more than he himself has already done. Not even to the extent with which he has already done it. Let's be honest. We're kind of hard to love, aren't we? Every single one of us. We're kind of hard to love. Even we have a hard time loving ourselves sometimes. But the one we are called to be faithful to is not like you or I. What kind of person has God displayed himself to be? Are we going to have to stand before him while he says, get away from me, I'm too holy for you? Even though that might be true. It's not what he said. Rather, he sent his Son to die so that we might be able to stand before him and so that we might be clean and have life. God isn't exactly a project. And so when we're talking about God's call on us to be faithful to him, well, Well, let's face it, it's a whole lot easier than God, the call on God to be faithful to us. We're called to a much lesser degree of faithfulness than what God has already displayed towards us. When we imagine God's role in our lives in accomplishing what He has called us to do, I think we should picture something like this. If you could go ahead to the next slide there for me, Ellen. Something like that. As most of you know, I coach youth hockey. This is from a few years ago. That kid's taller than me now. But I coach youth hockey, specifically goaltenders. Now, on this day, I didn't get dressed up so that I could take a picture. I wasn't supposed to be taking any pictures. It was picture day for the team. I didn't know about it. I already had my gear on before the fact. And even after I found that out, I still wasn't planning on taking a picture. So, if I didn't dress up so that I could get a picture, why am I wearing the goalie gear? Why would I wear goalie gear to go out and coach kids like that? When I'm not going to take a single shot the entire day. There's already a goalie in net. Why would I wear the goalie gear? Well, what is the easiest way to learn?
Example.
To see it, right? To see it. I'm wearing my goalie gear because the best way to learn is to see. I don't just say, do this, do that, and I don't wear my goalie gear every single practice, just on occasion. But I get out there and I say, I want you to do this. Let me show you. I want you to slide a butterfly slide. I want your skate to hit the post, gloves up, stick down, and I show him how to do it. This is what God has done for us in His Word. As we look back on this, and we see that God is not calling us to something new, but He's calling us to something very old, we should see this going on. God is, think about it, even Jesus. Jesus became what? A man. Why would Jesus become a man? What was that passage we read in Hebrews? So He might help us when we are tempted? So He might show us the way? God essentially said, okay, these people need help. I'm going to put on my gear, and I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to show them how it's done. God's faithfulness is displayed in the lives of many of us. It's displayed in His creative masterpiece that is the universe and humanity. He's showing us constantly in His Word, in the people around us, in His creation. He's showing us who He is. He's showing us how it's done. And He's giving us the example over and over and over again. God is not calling us to do something new. He's not calling us to reinvent the wheel. He's calling us to do something that's already been done. You can go ahead and take that off there, Alan. Thank you. On top of that, as we said, think about the Jesus story. God figuratively put on His equipment and got in the game to show us how it was done. God became flesh. He was tempted as we are tempted. He grew and learned as a child. He skinned His knees. He sneezed when the dust was stirred. And tears stained His cheeks as He lost loved ones. Jesus experienced pain and suffering just like every one of us do. He experienced social scorn and stress. In fact, even to a greater degree than we ever could. My stress has never caused me to sweat blood. Which, by the way, is not some miraculous happening. This is a medical fact. In rare moments of the most extreme stress, there has happened on a medical record where people have sweated blood. Capillaries have broken and blood has dripped from their forehead. But this conversation has to come right back to the theme of familiarity. If we are not familiar with God, with His Word, with His church, then there will be no examples for us to see. God has shown us how to do everything He has called us to do. But if we are unfamiliar with God, unfamiliar with His people, unfamiliar with His Word, then we are running blind. Then we are trying to do something we've never seen done. There will be moments when we can look on and say, if we are familiar with God, oh, that's how you do it. God has showed up. Said, here I am, let me show you. He's gotten dressed in his gear, ready to show us a butterfly slide. It's a hockey thing for goalies. We can't be like the people of Israel saying, I'm fine, I got it, I know how. Even if we think we do know how. We have to admit that, well, He knows a little bit more than we do, doesn't He? Faithfulness is a difficult process. We never can deny that. We always must accept that. But when we try to do it ourselves, when we try to reinvent the wheel, we have to know that we are making a difficult process even harder. And we will probably fail. This is why so many times Christianity seems insurmountable to many. We can make it harder than it already is, taking a difficult task and making it into an impossible one. For every single moment in our lives, we must realize God has already done that before. He has shown us the way. He has given us the example. So let us take that next step towards maturity as a body. And let's use what God has given to us. I'm going to leave you with one last passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11 and 12 today. We'll close with this. Well, we'll sing a song after. In reference to the story of Israel, Paul says, and there are many failures, Paul tells us, now all these things happened to them as an example. But they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall.